they say the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. But no one said the first step couldn't be on a scooter or in an Uber or on an airplane, right? Well, the point is today's transportation world is amazing. A wonderful diversity of options that get you from A to B, including electric vehicles, maybe even connected and autonomous vehicles. There's a huge diversity of options. The problem is the energy resources that fuel those options are very limited. There are very few options in terms of the diversity of the energy sources that get us around. The reality is that transportation's in a major transition right now. There have been transformative improvements in the efficiency of travel, in the modes of travel, like we mentioned, ride-hailing, improved access to public transit, and getting places even faster than before. So I'm Dr. Rich Simmons, and the purpose of this video is to explain a little bit about how the transportation energy that we use is a very tangible way in which we interact with our energy resources. So let's break it down. Okay, so now as we break this down, we can think about all of the energy that we use and model this on a pie chart. The largest wedge of that pie would be buildings. That would include residences, commercial buildings like malls, industrial buildings like factories. They use 40% of the U.S. energy. Then tied at number 2 at 30% each would be industrial processes and transportation. Industrial processes, that would be the energy that goes in to make raw materials, finished materials like steel, concrete, plastic, as well as the energy that goes into finished goods like appliances, cars, and electronics. So then we move to transportation, the other large wedge, and we see that on this Sankey plot, which is a Department of Energy model that shows sources on the left and end-use sectors on the right, we see now that glaring point that 90% of our energy for transportation is coming from crude oil, which ultimately get refined into gasoline and diesel and jet fuel. So we see the need for solutions that can reduce this dependence on single source, including things like electric and connected vehicles and advanced energy efficiency measures, as well as potentially biofuels. So we'll visit one more location now and talk more about those technologies. Okay. Now, when we think about petroleum and the transportation sector, there are lots of vehicles that use refined petroleum products. Of course, cars are an obvious one. A large percentage of the vehicle fleet in the United States is trucks and SUVs and crossovers and vans. But also we have all kinds of heavy-duty vehicles, obviously freight traffic and heavy-duty trucks and airplanes, and rounding that out. When we think about ways of improving this dependence, we could think about all families of technology. Some families are dealing with the vehicle itself in terms of lightweighting, making it more efficient, maybe transmissions that use more gears and therefore give you a smoother, more efficient ride. And then when we think about the powertrain, there's a big opportunity not only to improve the efficiency of the engine with things like turbochargers, which actually run at higher compression and allow you to run smaller displacement and save fuel, but also the whole family of hybrid technologies where we can use gas when it makes sense, but also be able to use an electric power plant and regenerate kinetic energy when that is possible. And then, of course, the long-term goal is to get to more electrification in general, getting EVs that run longer range. The other subset, before we get into EVs, is the whole sector of the advanced fuels opportunity, which includes biofuels like ethanol and biodiesel, as well as advanced cellulosic fuels. and ultimately a very interesting field in synthetic renewable hydrocarbons, where we take renewable electricity and convert it from things like solar and wind, and basically take water and carbon dioxide and disassociate those and recombine them into synthetic hydrocarbons. Well, it looks like I'm all fueled up for now, so let's continue this with a discussion about electric vehicles. Okay, we talked a bit about how energy demand splits into electricity and other categories. Now we're going to talk about the demand for vehicles, the transportation sector, as well as the demand for other petroleum and fuels, such as natural gas and heating oil. In general, in the United States, we talked about energy demand coming from different sources and being used in different sectors. This particular graph demonstrates the flow that the largest single source of energy going to transportation is petroleum. It approximately accounts for 30% of our total energy demand. Natural gas is another important contributor to non-electricity sources of demand. And the primary uses for the natural gas is to heat spaces and water primarily. And between those two, it's 2/3 of the US demand for natural gas. The Southeast region is typical, more or less, to the national average. Now moving from natural gas to liquids, most of our liquids for transportation come from petroleum. Now most of those are going to gasoline, that is refined products that go into our cars. Another large piece of that goes into what's known as distillate fuels, which become diesel fuels. When we add aviation or jet fuels to that, we are accounting for nearly 85% of all fuels going to the transportation sector. To add to that, we have some biofuels and some other categories of liquids that are refined to make, again, transportation fuel products. Looking within the Southeast region by state, we see that each state consumes in proportion to its population, and therefore Florida accounts for the largest demand within the Southeast states. And then looking more closely within each state, the largest piece is generally gasoline, followed closely by distillate fuel or diesel, and then the third category is generally aviation or jet fuel, and then in many cases there is another allocation. Let's look a little bit more closely at the US vehicle fleet. There are a couple of points to make on this slide. First of all, in terms of the number of vehicles, light trucks and cars make up the largest majority. 75% or so are passenger cars, another 21% are light trucks. Rounding out the fleet by units are heavy trucks and buses, and then the rest of the vehicles. That is by the units. Now when we look at the energy use, even though heavy trucks account for a small percent of the fleet, but a disproportionate share of the energy. So that's an important consideration. This large demand is prevalent across almost every state in the country, although some states are doing different things to promote alternatives to petroleum fuels, including biofuels and electric vehicle markets. There's a lot of excitement about the potential of electric cars. In fact, you would think we were having a revolution. But in fact, when you go back through history, you realize electric cars are not a very new thing. And this timeline helps to demonstrate that they're a concept that have been around for quite a while. And now let's talk about the recent advent and return of the electric vehicle. It turns out a lot of study has gone into the capability of these vehicles to address, the range limitations that have plagued some of the early launches. And in parallel with that, a lot of great technical developments on the battery chemistry side to improve the cost, durability, and range and energy storage capabilities of current batteries. So what is driving this trend toward electric vehicles? And by the way, I prefer my puns intended. What's driving this trend is a push toward lower emissions, right? And a cleaner economy. And so when you think about comparing electric vehicles and their CO2 emissions from conventional vehicles, you have to consider where they're getting their electricity from. But on average, on a national average basis, electric vehicles are substantially cleaner than internal combustion engine vehicles. it would be important for you in your specific region to investigate what the grid is like and what the carbon intensity of your electricity source is to know exactly how much better your EV may be in a given city like Atlanta, but it's important to note that it is generally lower carbon. Another important trend that's driving this phenomenon is the rollout of charging stations, right? The investment by utilities and private companies and even individuals to increase the number of places and the access for electric vehicle owners to plug in. And so just to round out this segment, we're going to show you a map of the United States, which demonstrates where charging locations are now, and also some sense of how many of them are in use at a given time. So there is a need for more, of course, but the trend has just been dramatic. So we've talked about some of the challenges for transportation energy and some of the solutions, of which electric vehicles are definitely a major one. And let's just see here now. Looks like we're all charged up. So why don't you come along for the ride?